Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I want to talk about This Is Our Castle and Dungeons and Dragons. And specifically, what I want to talk about is when the player characters complete a quest, right? How do they shift and change the purpose of who they are and what they're doing? Because this becomes necessary. And I recently saw this in every Dungeon Master content, and I want to point you to this every Dungeon Master content. And I want you to understand how important it is that we pay attention to this show and that we emulate it. And there's this powerful lesson for players, for Dungeon Masters to point their players to redefining their purpose and redefining their own quests and their own boundaries. Actually, redefining their own boundaries for quests, okay? So we're talking about a higher level tier of Dungeons and Dragons, and I want to get into this. All right. So first of all, the show is Disney Plus's Gargoyles, an absolutely fantastic show. I believe it's from the I think it's from the 90s, right? And it's Goliath and Lexington and Bronx and Hudson. It's amazing. It's an amazing animated American Saturday morning cartoon, and it's exactly in the same exactly in the 1980s American Saturday morning cartoon milieu that Dungeons and Dragons the cartoon show from 1983 to 1986 fits in. The animation is very similar, the pacing is very similar. That American Saturday morning cartoon energy is all over it. It's the same thing, right? And it's beautiful, and it has a lot of wisdom in it, right? So basically, Goliath is the leader of the Gargoyles, right? And the Gargoyles lived 1,000 years ago, and they protected this castle. And basically, what would happen is at dawn, they would go onto the castle and they would turn into gargoyles. And the humans would protect the gargoyles during the day, make sure that nobody smashed them, right? And then at night, the gargoyles would get up and they would protect the castle, right? Now, what ends up happening is Xanatos, he's the bad guy of the show, but bad guy is in quotes there. He might be a neutral character. He's a very interesting guy. But Xanatos is... he moves the castle and puts it on a skyscraper in the middle of New York City in the 1990s, right? And now Goliath and Lexington and Bronx and Hudson, they all wake up, and crack off their stone shells and become living creatures at night. And Xanatos is like, you guys are going to work for me. And they're like, no, we ain't going to do that, right? And then they have to escape into the city and become independent, right? And they link up with a New York City police officer by the name of Elisa Mazza, right? And they're like, and then they find a clock tower, and they spend the entire season one kind of fighting off Xanatos and finding their new home and finding their way in their new home. And now they're citizens of New York City, right? They don't live 1,000 years ago. They live now, right? And there's a point where at the end of season one where they're like, hey, we can't live in the castle anymore. Xanatos owns that. Our job as gargoyles is to protect the castle, right? And Goliath says something beautiful and wise, and he says, this island, Manhattan, this is our castle. We protect it. We protect the people here, right? And it changes the entire show where now the gargoyles are the protectors of Manhattan, and they're essentially superheroes. And they Batman it up. They threaten, criminals, and they just go to town and protect all of Manhattan at night, all the innocent people in Manhattan. And it's brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. And what I thought was really interesting about it is we as Dungeon Masters need to explain to players, and I think a lot of Dungeon Masters do a very bad job of this. Very bad job of this, right? And basically, there's this, if you're a bad Dungeon Master, you run a crap game, and you'll hear this advice. I cannot believe how many channels actually talk about, well, you've put the adventure up there. It's for the it's for the players to choose the adventure you put in front of them. Bull crap, right? You put forward 2 to 3 quests every session, right? If they're not in an ongoing quest. As soon as they're done with a quest, you need to put up 2 or 3 quests, and you need to be, and basically, you need to be using representative minis. This is why I don't spend hundreds of dollars on representative minis, because when you do that and you spend, 2.5 hours picking all your minis, you're going to force your players to go through what you prepared, right? That's one of the reasons why I've switched to Legos and used these representative minis, and I can build my physical representations of the monsters and the non-player characters and the player characters with representative minis, right, rather than exact minis, so that the choice to choose the quests is real, not fake, right? And there's a lot of railroading that happens, and often that railroading is coming simply by you spending 2.5 hours choosing your minis, right? And people don't want to hear this. They're like, oh, I got Dwarven Forge, I can't, and I got a bunch of, I bought 30 elf minis. I don't care, right? Like, if your players say, I don't want that quest, they don't run it, right? And that's the issue, right? And so one of the things is, what is being shown here in Gargoyles is you need to draw the player characters are like, we're going to accept these types of quests, and we may change it. And you as the Dungeon Master are going to run the adventures we want, right? I don't care if you spend 2.5 hours picking minis this week. We're not going to run your crap adventure. We choose the quests we want to complete, right? And that's incredibly critical. And it's a cycle between the Dungeon Master and the players, right? And I love this redefinition of this is our castle, right? And as players, and actually, I'm not speaking to players, and one of the reasons why is I don't think there's any point in speaking to players. And the reason why is there are no great player champions. If you are an incredibly engaged player, you just turn into a Dungeon Master. There's no Matthew Mercer of players. He doesn't exist, right? But there's tons, Brennan Lee Mulligan and Aubrey Aubrey cannot pronounce her last name. Very famous Dungeon Master. And Matthew Mercer, but there are no famous players, right? And so we as Dungeon Masters need to teach player characters to do this correctly, to shape the correct amount of to put a box around the quests they will choose, and for them to say 2-3 times in a campaign, this is our castle, and change it. It's fascinating. It's beautifully illustrated in Gargoyles, and it's absolutely correct. And it's something we need to teach players to do as Dungeon Masters. I wish there was some hyper engaged, awesome player listening to this, but there's not. They don't exist anywhere in the world. We've never really seen the player champion. We've never seen the Matthew Mercer player. And until that emerges, there's no point in talking to players. Just talk to engaged Dungeon Masters. Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.